Let's look now at the alliance that exists between the Gulf states and the Western powers, in particular United States of America. You know that as we discussed, the local rulerships, they came to power independently, and quite a few of them had been in power for a very long time. But at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, we see that they become de facto protectorates of the British Empire. And then as the role of the British Empire dramatically decreases after the Second World War, the United States takes over that protective role. And that is an alliance and a symbiotic relationship that persists to this day. The principalities that we're dealing with, most of them are very small. Saudi Arabia is the exception, but even Saudi Arabia's population is relatively small in relation to the populous neighbors that exist in the region, particularly Iraq, Egypt, and Iran. And what we see here also is the persistence of these small principalities is somewhat an anomaly. If you recall what we discussed in the last videos about what Charles Tilly said about state formation, there is something that we normally observe is that smaller units get merged into larger units, basically for reasons of defense ultimately. This does not happen here. And the persistence of these tiny, otherwise unsustainable and certainly indefensible principalities, and the inability of the larger neighbors to gobble them up, is a function of this protection by the external power. And here it's important to realize that there is a commonality of interest between the external power and the local rulers. So in a sense, the local rulers have interests that largely coincide with the colonial or neo-colonial interests of the external force. And it's this commonality of interest that ultimately prevents a territorial consolidation. And the Sultanate of Brunei that you see here is perhaps the most striking example of this. It's a tiny principality taken out of the Federation of Malaysia at the time of independence. And you see even its territory is non-contiguous. And it continues since then under British patronage. And almost the only reason for its existence is that it has lots of oil and makes this oil available to foreign oil companies at much more attractive rates than Malaysia would. Probably Malaysia has its own oil industry and would be a much more assertive partner in exploring this oil than Brunei has. And Brunei it's the way the government and its society structure is very, very similar to some of the Gulf societies that we see. You have an extremely rich ruling family that basically disposes of the oil wealth in a family, as a family possession, and tries to ensure internal stability through patronage and welfare payments, and external stability through external protection. So there is an element of disingenuousness when we hear foreign powers talking about territorial integrity in these areas, because it's that insistence on territorial integrity that prevents territorial consolidation that perhaps would create more serious, more sustainable units. And it conveniently prevents the creation of political units that might actually challenge some of the entrenched interests that exists. And again, think of the Malaysia-Brunei arrangement. The alliance is further on based not just on this common fear of big regional neighbors. It's also based on a commonality of economic interests. That is, on the one hand, as we discussed already, these very rich principalities are avid purchasers of not only consumer goods, but also military hardware. they have become very active investors in Western, in the Western economies themselves, mainly due because there's no natural outlet for the resource flows that accrue to them. So they have been investing in heavily in Western companies. And here it might be useful to remember that in the Gulf principalities are now all owning their national oil companies and the oil installations. But the way this has been achieved was not, as we discussed for Egypt or as we will discuss with Iran, through nationalization and expropriation, but it was simply done by purchasing the companies from their foreign owners. So it was a much more agreeable relationship, and a relationship that ensured the continuation of technical expertise and market access. And that also facilitated, this reinvestment of oil receipts into the Western economy. So we see now a very close symbiotic relationship also on the economic front. Now, one other aspect that is important is you probably have heard of the OPEC oil cartel. And what is a cartel, you might wonder? It's basically, it's a grouping of producers of a good or service with the aim of artificially constricting supply in order to keep prices either stable or raise prices. And you can have a cartel among producers, and you could also theoretically have a cartel among consumers, but that is more rare. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, with its seat in Vienna, is probably the best known cartel. And it was founded to represent the interests of the primary oil producers and improve the negotiation position vis-à-vis Western consumers. And it's important to note that not all major oil-producing companies are members of OPEC. The most important one that is not a member is probably Russia, but also with the discovery of oil in Western Europe, the Western oil producers have never been member of OPEC. So Norway or Scotland or Denmark to some extent, they've never been part of OPEC. Within OPEC, the way it works is that in the meetings, the individual member states who are oil producers are allocated certain production quotas. And oil being a global commodity, the price is set by the global supply. Now, I already told you that some producers are not member of OPEC, but that production that is under the control of OPEC is then, it is decided communally how much oil they want to throw on the market, and that is then distributed internally among the different producers. And you can already see here that there's a scope for political debate between them. Most importantly, however, we have most of the member states producing close to their maximum production capacity. And also particularly the larger states, particularly Iran and Iraq, have a very great need for the oil revenue. So they have an interest, and they're actually, due to the way their budgets are organized, they're required to produce the maximum quota. And actually, technically, they're not able to produce much more than the quota allocated to them because the way their installations are organized. And it's here that Saudi Arabia in particular occupies a very prominent role as a swing producer. Now you wonder, what is a swing producer? It's exactly what you expect. It's a producer that can adapt its rate of output quite flexibly. So it's a producer that can increase or decrease the commodity supply with minimal internal cost. And that the internal cost is due to the installations. If you have installations that run at maximum capacity, it's not that easy to reduce output. And also budgetary requirements. If you like in the large populous nations, if you require a certain amount of minimum income, you cannot produce less than this, because then you will run into budgetary problems. Saudi Arabia now, due to the fact the way the geological nature of its oil deposits and the way the installations work, is able to dramatically increase output at a very short notice. And at the same time, it has a relatively small population and very large oil reserves. So it can adapt its production very quickly in response to market rates. And here on this chart, you see the declared reserves that some of the OPEC members have. And you see the top violet chart, these are the oil reserves that Saudi Arabia has. So you see they're vastly greater than all the reserves of the others. And importantly, also the production facilities that Saudi Arabia has allow them to produce much more than the others if need be. And it's here that there's a certain paradoxical sounding fact that Saudi Arabia, as a producer, is not necessarily interested in obtaining the highest possible price for its oil. And it's important now to know Saudi Arabia is an active and important member of OPEC, and it is interested in achieving a high price. But there are at least 4 reasons why it is not maximizing oil prices. And that's these 4 reasons, they coincide, these interests coincide with their Western consumers. First, they do not have no interest in harming Western economies in the short or medium term, on whose stable demand they depend. So they have an interest in stabilizing the impact of prices on their Western consumers. Secondly, as I said, they have very important investments in Western economies. So they want to protect the profitability of these investments. So again, they have no interest in harming Western economies as such. Thirdly, and not unimportantly, they do not want to harm the political links to the external forces that protect them, primarily the United States. So there is here 3 reasons why that all link back to their alliance with the Western powers. But fourth, and that is perhaps the most counterintuitive fact here, is that unlike their ideological and geostrategic competitors in the region, primarily Iraq in the old days and Iran, but also Egypt to some extent. So Egypt is not a big producer. They have a relatively small population, so their need for oil income is relatively muted, unlike Iraq and Iran, whose large populations required a much larger daily income of monies to fund the consumption that is going through. So in order to, if need be, Saudi Arabia was able to harm these 2 competitors by bringing the oil price down a certain threshold. Because both Iran and Iraq required a certain threshold in order to break even in the government budgets. And so Saudi Arabia was always in a position to affect this minimum oil price that can exist. And this is an interest which puts it in opposition to them. And it's something that the particular nature of its oil deposits and its oil installations allowed it to do, and it's a role it has very actively played. Now, let's come to another aspect of the alliance that exists between the Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states and their Western patrons. And there is here an internal paradox, and that's what I'd like you to draw your attention to. We already mentioned a few times that particularly Saudi Arabia, but also the other Gulf countries, rely on a particular domestic notion of Islam, which is very puritanical and quite xenophobic in the way it is interpreted. And this legitimizing alliance with Wahhabi Islam is creates certain vulnerabilities for the ruling structure. First is the compromising lifestyle of the royal family, which is very ostentatious and not necessarily in line with that puritanical vision of an austere Islamic normatively driven life. Secondly, it's their dependence on the infidel protectors, and which became dramatically apparent in the 1990-1991 invasion of Kuwait and the subsequent liberation of Kuwait by primarily American forces, which required the basing of large numbers of American soldiers on Saudi territory. And the third vulnerability stems from the compromised stature of the official ulema that we mentioned already in the last video, who are now outrun by more popular, more radical exponents of Islam that have a hold on popular the way Islam is lived in popular circles in the Gulf. So we see here a structural tendency towards radicalization in society, particularly with respect to the way Islam is lived and the dominant interpretation of Islam. And it might not be readily apparent to do why there should be a structural tendency towards this. After all, these societies already depend on a very puritanical, very strict notion of Islam. So if there's need for an alternative vision, you might think that it could just as well be a liberal interpretation of Islam. But now think that one of the key points of contention that exists in these populations with respect with the grievance that they have towards the government is their close alliance and their close dependency on foreigners. And these foreigners tend to be Western, and they tend to come from liberally organized states. So while it's in theory conceivable that a more liberal version of Islam might challenge the puritanical official notion, it's quite unlikely to happen because that liberal notion would be closer to the Western lifestyle as lived by the foreign patrons. So we see any opposition, any alternative notion that is challenging the official interpretation and the official symbiosis that exists, the cultural vision that exists in the country, will have to be non-Western, will be more radical than the official notion. So and this is the structural tendency towards an ever more polarized notion of religion here. We see that these notions of the image of society and the notion of religion and both in official circles and the unofficial attacks, the strongly anti-Western slant that they have, that they will have an impact on the integrity of the alliance and the willingness of Western populations to incur costs in support of this alliance. And we see exactly this happening, for example, during the liberation of Kuwait, when these societies all of a sudden now depend on Western support, and not just elite support, but when the Western populations would have to actually bear the costs in treasure and blood to actually go and become actively involved on behalf of these family ruling circles. We then see attempts at reform, albeit at a glacial pace. You see, like in Kuwait, after the liberation, they now then introduced voting reforms. They introduced some proto-parliamentary systems. We see now in Saudi Arabia recently, they introduced, albeit in a very, very circumscribed role, they extended voting rights, both passive and active, for women. But there is, by and large, this is not an alliance that enjoys a lot of popular support, both within the countries in the Gulf and also not within the Western countries. And that creates an internal instability of the alliance that I'd like you to pay attention to. The last point I'd like to make is the external aspect that is undermining the integrity of that alliance. And that is, as I said, there is this tendency towards radicalization of religious discourse. And it takes the form of financial support for external groups. And that is something that we mentioned already, is the support given by official channels to build mosques and fund madrasas and centers of Islamic learning that have had a very insidious impact on these societies and generally have led to an export of the Wahhabi puritanical notions of Islam into areas where these puritanical notions did not exist. So this is the official channel. And then alongside this, we have private Saudi and Gulf charities and individuals who fund large sums of money towards even more radical interpretations of Islam, propagating, often using violent means, propagating a particular notion of religion and the role of religion in society. And it's here where these activities, both of which, both the official and certainly the unofficial activities, directly clash with national interests of Western countries that otherwise are in alliance with these countries. It's not something that's actively discussed, but when we look at Afghanistan, as we will do in 2-3 weeks, you will see that a lot of the internal radicalization that determines the opposition is the result of funding patterns that exist now for several decades and that are directly linked to the Gulf. We all know the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban in the last year of their reign, which was decried universally as a dramatic act of barbarism, of cultural heritage being destroyed for no real reason. And it's important to see that this is not an act that is without precedence. We see the Saudis, ever since they assumed power in the early 19th century, when they the first time gained control over Mecca and Medina, they started destroying cultural patrimony that was linked to the age of the Prophet. And it's destructions that continue right up to present eras. And it's linked to a particular notion of a fear of idolatry that Wahhabism has, and therefore it's a controversial issue. It's not something that the Saudis propagate very actively, but we do see a fairly extensive practice of destruction of cultural heritage for reasons in pursuit of a religious dogma. And in a sense, that's exactly what the Taliban have been doing. And that's what the point I'm trying to make here is that the ideas that are now lived out in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, these are ideas that are not without precedence, that they are linked back to the export of ideas that have sprang up in the Gulf decades earlier. And they've been propagated with financial means that are linked to the particular social arrangement we have in the Gulf. And here, it's a point we will come back to when we talk about Afghanistan, it's important to understand that the Western powers, despite their rhetoric, have consistently allied themselves with anti-modernist forces that, in pursuit of an alliance that serves one particular relatively narrow need, i.e. the need for stable energy supplies, but it's otherwise at odds with both normative and practical political interests that these countries have. And we see here there's a discrepancy in this alliance. So it's both domestic and it's in terms of the way it plays out in foreign policy. And this creates a certain tension and a source for instability in the alliance. So in the last video of this week, we look at some of the unresolved contradictions that exist in the Gulf societies internally and in the way their foreign policies are structured.